It is a pleasure to be with you, especially since I am a Philadelphian. It's always great to come home, and indeed my parents have joined us today. They still live in Philly. And I want to talk with you about present bias and its consequences for self-defeating choices and the prospect of actually engaging in policies that help people make better choices. Now, to set the stage, let me just tell you about behavioral economics. Behavioral economics acknowledges the traditional elements of economics, that economic incentives and information matter. They influence behavior, but there are other things that matter. Indeed, psychology matters a lot, and scholars like Shelley Taylor, who was honored this afternoon as an inductee, is the sort of psychologist that we've been avidly reading. Shelley doesn't know this, but when I was a doctoral student, I spent many, many weeks exhaustively reading many of her papers, and I'm indebted to her for my training, and she's inspired me continuously to this day. So we're looking to psychology for inspiration, and we're recognizing that people are not perfectly rational, that they don't have infinite attention, that they are not perfectly self-controlled, and that social things matter, things like fairness and how we divide up the pie, not just how much I get myself. Now, in addition to all of those mechanisms, we're also thinking about how to help people make better choices. So we're thinking about nudges that target these psychological roots of our self-defeating choices and how those nudges might enable people to make better choices without necessarily changing their economic incentives. And I'll show you examples of that as we go through the talk. So let me begin with a psychological mechanism that I've been studying a lot during my career, and I'll illustrate that with an important example. By the way, the clock has not started, so I'm assuming I get all this extra time. Someone should do something about this clock, or I'll just keep talking all afternoon. Good, there it goes. Oh, okay, I didn't mean that. It's jumping ahead. That was a lot of time that just vanished. This is a study that was done with Dutch workers, and they were asked, what snack would you like to be delivered? Not right now, but in a week's time. So think about what these Dutch workers might say. The snack they want to be delivered in 7 days' time. What do you think they asked for? Right, so they asked for one of the healthier snacks that was brought to them, and overwhelmingly they chose the fruit. And then the researchers came back a week later and said, well, we've brought you your snacks, we're ready to deliver them, but we've left your forms back at the lab, and you've got to choose again. Now, what do you think these Dutch workers had to say when they're asked about the snack they want right now? Exactly. So before it was overwhelmingly fruit, and now it's overwhelmingly chocolate. Same type of thing happens with movie choices. When researchers ask undergraduates about what movies they want to watch, and they give them a choice of 24 movies, some of which are lowbrow, some of which are highbrow, something like The Seventh Seal, a movie about death, existentialism, and the plague, versus a movie like Batman. When they're asked what movie they want to watch tonight, they overwhelmingly say they want to watch one of these lowbrow movies. But when the undergraduates are asked what movie they want to watch in a week's time, they begin to switch. Now it's 37% lowbrow, and in 2 weeks' time it becomes 29% lowbrow. So we see this interesting pattern of behavior in this domain as well. Now another domain is feeding behavior at very high frequency. And so the subjects in this study were asked not to drink any fluid for 4 hours before the experiment actually occurred. And then the participants in this study get to the lab, and they are then given potato chips. So they're very, very thirsty. And at that point, they're asked to make a diabolical choice between 1 sip of juice now or 2 sips of juice in 5 minutes. And what do you think these undergraduates have to say to 1 sip now versus 2 sips in 5 minutes? And by the way, they're going to stay for the full 45 minutes of the study no matter what they choose. So this does not get them out of school early. What do you think they choose? 1 now. But in the same study, subjects are also asked this question. What about 1 sip in 20 minutes or 2 sips in 25 minutes? How do you feel about that? exactly. So you think just the way they do, we see this interesting change in behavior. People are flipping and becoming more patient as the decision is pushed away in time. Now, to understand this, something called present bias or hyperbolic discounting has been deployed by psychologists and economists. The particular form that I want to talk with you about today is a very, very simple representation of these preferences, one that says that stuff that happens right now gets full psychological weight in our minds, and things that happen later only get half weight in our minds. And this is psychologically speaking, not in a financial market, but the way we process it, the way we feel about it. Now let's think about the consequences of these preferences for human behavior, and let's do that in the setting of exercise, my personal favorite failing. And imagine that exercise offers an immediate cost of 6. That is the absolute misery of sitting on a sweaty seat when it's someone else's sweat, and then exerting yourself for a half an hour, something that I personally hate to do. But exercise presumably has some delayed benefit. Maybe it's going to make me healthier, maybe it's going to extend my life in the future. Everyone else tells me that at least. So exercise in this example, let's say, has 8 units of benefit coming later in time. That might be drip benefits that occur over many years. Now, in this setting, with the preferences that I described to you earlier, when will the individual exercise? Will the individual agree to exercise today? No, exactly, because there's a cost of 6, there's a delayed benefit of 8. Psychologically speaking, the delayed benefit of 8 is half-weighted, and consequently, psychologically, that opportunity to exercise today gets a valuation of -2. Now, that's a good prediction of my willingness to exercise today. I don't know how it is for you, but that describes me to a T. But how do I feel, how do you feel, and what does the model have to say about your preferences today for exercising in the future? So in this model, if I were to think today, Thursday, about exercising on Friday, well, the model says that that's a good idea, because up front, there's 0 cost. Tomorrow, I'm going to pay this cost of 6, and then even later, I'm going to get a benefit of 8. They're both discounted by a half. Why? Because they're both not today. So they're both in the future, and they're both downweighted by a half. And that's exactly what the psychology and what the mathematics says. So the prediction is that the individual does not want to exercise today, but is happy to plan today to exercise tomorrow. And what happens tomorrow? Okay, good, you get it. So, this is the human condition. We're full of good aspirations and terrible follow-through. Now, we see this behavior in many domains. Wonderful study done by Delavigne and Malmondier, where they study gym members in the Boston area, and they found that people were paying $75 per membership per month, and that on average, because these researchers had swipe data, people were going 4 times per month to these gyms and paying a cost of $19 per visit. Now, that might make sense. Maybe people are willing to pay $20 per visit to the gym. But what makes this particularly interesting is that there was another way to go to the gym. You didn't need to have a membership. You could simply go on a per-visit basis. And what did it cost to go on a per-visit basis at these gyms? $10. Exactly. And when people were surveyed and asked how often they thought they were going to go, they thought they were going to go far more frequently than 4 times per month. Now, this is particularly pertinent for me because a few years ago, I joined a gym after I had advised this dissertation and done decades of work on this topic. I still joined a gym, and I gave the gym $1,000 for a 1-year membership. And I thought I was going to go 2 or 3 times per week for that year. So that would be 100 to 150 visits for a year, justifying my $1,000 membership. How many times do you think I actually went to that gym over that next year? Okay, whoever said 20, I love you. So I went 5 times at a cost of $200 per visit. Now, it's not just gyms that we're not going to. There's lots of other behaviors that are really important where we have good intentions that don't match up with our subsequent actions. So if we look at retirement savings and we survey American workers, we find that out of every 100 people surveyed, about 2 out of 3 say they're not saving enough for retirement. and about 24 out of 100 say that they were going to raise their 401k savings rate over the next 2 months. Now, my co-authors and I, James Choi and Bridget Madrian and Andrew Metrick, actually have administrative data from these retirement savings plans. So we can go and check to see whether people actually did raise their savings rate over the next 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. Let's go to 4 months and give people a little extra time. How many people do you think actually, out of 100, tend to increase their savings rate over the next 4 months? So 3, they did better than you thought. But this is the story of our lives. We know we're not quite living up to our own model of our good behavior. We have good intentions for the future, but we don't follow through. Now, I want to turn to the behavior change part of this conversation because we're beginning to figure out that there are ways to help people overcome these biases, especially present bias. Now, one of the major interventions that has been used is to change the way that we join different programs, like a retirement savings program. The standard way of joining a retirement savings program is opting in, where there's an undesired behavior, you're a non-participant, and then you go through some minor administrative step, let's say a 15-minute enrollment process, and then you become a participant in the plan. And starting in the 1990s, Dick Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize, was the first to have this insight, and then Bridget Madrian was the first to study this behavior. People began to say, hey, what if we can flip the starting point and start people as participants and then give them the opportunity to opt out rather than asking them to opt in? And we'll see in a second that this seemingly trivial change, which does not change the underlying economic incentives, makes an enormous change to the outcomes. Now, suppose you're a hardcore libertarian and you don't like unbalancing the playing field, and you'd like to treat savings or not savings as kind of equally legitimized or equally endorsed options to your employees, the people who are going to be affected by the savings plan. What might you do? What alternative do we have to making one thing the default and the other thing the non-default? Randomize. Oh, you could randomize, right? That would be particularly arbitrary. Another alternative, other than randomizing, would be to tell people to make an active choice. So you could ask people to make a decision between A or B without making either of them the default outcome. And you could require an active choice. So people must choose for themselves in these active choice regimes. And when we do that, we're going to also see enormous changes to behavior, though we haven't actually changed the economic incentives. We're going to get many more people to join savings plans when we set them up this way than when we ask people to opt in if they want to do it. Now, let me give you one more example. I said that this 15-minute hurdle of enrolling in these plans makes an enormous difference. So obviously, what else could you do to facilitate enrolling in these plans for people who are prone to procrastinate because they have present bias? What alternative? Lower the barrier, exactly. So don't make it a 15-minute enrollment process, make it a 15-second enrollment process. So we've done that. We've offered people postcard enrollment, where we mail them a pre-populated postcard with the postage on it, and all they've got to do is check a box to become enrolled in these plans. So now let's look at the data from what are now dozens and dozens of studies using these different choice architectures to help people get to where they want to go, which is to be enrolled in their savings plans. So when we tell people they've got to enroll to be in the plan, we only see 40% of US households enrolling in their 401k during their first year of employment. When we make enrollment easy with check-a-box enrollment, quick enrollment, we drive that to 50 to 60% of households enrolled in their 401k savings plan. When we tell people that they must choose, when we make it an active choice system, it becomes 70% of households enrolled in their savings plan. And when we tell them that they're enrolled in the plan, and now if they don't like it, they can opt out, the enrollment rate goes to 90%. So you can see by simply changing the choice architecture, we see night and day differences in outcomes without changing the economic incentives. Now, this does not tell you which of these different systems is socially optimal, but it does tell you to worry about choice architecture when you set up systems of participation. Now, the same ideas actually apply in the health domain, too. I'll give you one example, though there are now hundreds. There's something called home delivery of chronic medication. So I have that. I have a malfunctioning thyroid gland, and levothyroxine is the drug that I'll take for the rest of my life to make my thyroid behave itself, or at least let my body deal with this non-behaving thyroid. Now, I could go to the pharmacy every month and pick up my prescription month by month, or I could have my prescription delivered to my home with a 90-day fill. Now, having it delivered to my home with a 90-day fill turns out to cost me less and even to cost my employer less. It's less expensive than having it picked up at the pharmacy, because the pharmacy is this local thing in an urban and dense place, whereas the thing that's mailed to my house is packaged in a factory far out in the countryside. Now, it turns out, even though this is money-saving and time-saving, very few people take this up. So what I want to do is show you what happens when we tried an active choice intervention to encourage people to think about home delivery as an option. So when we did a control analysis, we found that only 6% of people opted in to home delivery. But when we did an intervention where we required people to make an active choice, we got 40% choosing home delivery, only 38% actively choosing pharmacy pickup, and 22% ignoring us. So we ended up driving drastically up the fraction of people choosing home delivery, and at this one company where we tried this, the employees and the employer jointly saved $1 million that year in pharmacy costs. Most of those savings were for the employees. And now there are hundreds of companies who have adopted this procedure, saving our healthcare system many hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, we're beginning to learn a bit about the neural mechanisms behind this. We know that there's a prefrontal cortex where self-regulation seems to be especially implicated. There's a medial prefrontal cortex where signals are joined together from the center of self-regulation and other centers that seem to be driving this tendency to pursue instant gratification. So we're beginning to understand the neural foundations of this internal struggle between our view of doing the right thing and our view of pursuing immediate gratification. So just to summarize, it's your executive function in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that is enabling you to stay on your diet, and it is your dopamine reward system that is communicating the urgency of having that donut right now. Now, let me tell you about one more frontier in the little time I have remaining, which is the idea of regulating oneself. Not regulating others, but regulating oneself. And to do that, let me show you an experiment that my co-authors John Bashairs, James Choi, Bridget Madrian, and Jung-Suk Kung organized with me, where we asked US adults to make a choice to allocate $100 real between a freedom account that offered a 22% rate of interest and a goal account that also offered a 22% rate of interest, same exact rate of interest, annualized. But the goal account had a withdrawal restriction where you would set a goal date, and before that goal date, you would have access to your money only if you paid a 10% penalty for accessing your money early. Now, you could pick a goal date any point in the next year. What fraction of our representative sample of US adults do you think put some of their money into the goal account? 0. I agree, it doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense. If you're an economist, it makes no sense. But I presume this is not a room of economists. So about 80% of them put at least some of their money into the goal account. And if I use a dollar-weighted basis, about 35% of the dollars ended up in the goal account, which has that 10% penalty for early withdrawal. People liked the fact that they were locking up some of their money and preventing themselves from consuming it early. Now, what do you think happened when we raised the penalty on the goal account using different subjects drawn from the same population? So now we're going to have a higher penalty on the goal account. Now it's a 20% penalty for early withdrawal. Do you think that raised or lowered people's willingness to use the goal account? Okay, so I hear every answer possible, which is why we do this research. It raised it, and that difference is significant at a 5% threshold. And then we ran a third arm, where we asked people to evaluate a goal account. This is, again, different subjects drawn from the same population. Now they're asked, how do you feel about a goal account where there's no ability to access your money until the goal date that you choose for yourself? And once you choose it, it's fixed for good. So do you think this raises or lowers people's willingness to put money in the goal account? Again, a lot of different opinions. In the data, it raises, and we've replicated this result. So I don't want to argue that in general we're dying to have our arms bound, that we're dying to restrict ourselves, but I do want to acknowledge that people recognize, to a certain degree, their own self-control problems. Okay, so let me summarize. So, good intentions often deviate from our follow-through, from our actions. An important mechanism that lies behind this is present bias. Fortunately, there are scalable, inexpensive, and often free interventions that help us to better align our good intentions and our actions. The framework for designing these interventions is relatively simple. I mean, not that they always work, and they often don't work, and we need to study them empirically before we get excited about them. But the framework is to identify good intentions of your employees and your customers, and then to create a choice architecture that enables those good intentions to be easily expressed. For example, default enrollment, or active choice, or easy quick enrollment, or commitment. But to beware of nudges that people find to be coercive or insulting, like this nudge. You will all recall that Mayor Bloomberg, who did many wonderful things, did at least one thing that was very unpopular during his term as mayor. He banned the sale of 20-ounce Cokes, or tried to. He banned the sale of sodas that were more than 16 ounces. And indeed, that proved wildly unpopular and was eventually rejected by the courts. So, let me conclude. Present bias undermines our ability to make the best choices for ourselves, but these sorts of nudges, when deployed thoughtfully and carefully and with great sensitivity to the interests of the community, can sometimes help us make some progress and get us out of those self-defeating traps. Thank you very much.
So how much does explanation by the entity, the boss or whatever, offering this choice, mediate the kind of psychological instinct? So for instance, it occurred to me in the choice between the pickup at the pharmacy once a month or get it delivered, that if I were an employee, just given that choice without it being explained to me, I think someone's trying to pull a fast one on me. I know my druggist. I know I can go there. I know it's going to be there. If I just kind of give myself over to maybe some home delivery, won't come, whatever, I have these kind of feelings about it. And how much explanation would there need to be to get people to act smartly?
So, well, just to be clear, this is a domain where we don't think there is a right answer. So we think when 38% actively choose pharmacy pickup, we think that's a legitimate expression of their interest. And when 40% choose home delivery, we think that they have different preferences. And for example, you just made a great argument. Maybe you know the person behind the counter handing you your prescription, and it's an important relationship, and it's one that you want to maintain. Then you should keep picking it up at the pharmacy. Or maybe you're like me, and I live in Cambridge, and when I go to the pharmacy, it's always a different person behind the counter, and I don't know them, and there's about 15 people behind me in a very long line, and they're all sneezing. And the last thing I want to be is in that pharmacy picking up my levothyroxine every 30 days. So I think there's an important difference of opinion, and we need to kind of inform people about the two options, and then engage them in a choice that actually has significant consequences for them, both financially and time-wise.
So you would give an informed choice, not just an instinctive choice.
Yes.
You would say, here's a reason for doing this if you choose to do it.
So that's another great question. Informed choice, you said. We can't always make informed choices. So sometimes we're in a good position to make an informed choice because we've been given lots of information and then we know how to handle it because it's intuitive and comprehensible. And there's other settings where we're not likely to make a good choice, even if we're given piles of information. So for example, I sit on the investment committee of Harvard University's pension plan, and at one point we had 400 investment options. And you might say, well, that's great, because you can give people all these options and explain them all to them, and then they can make an informed choice. And instead, we made it 6 options. So sometimes you want to restrict people's choice set to help them make a better choice.
Right. Okay.
Quick question, a corollary to that question. Sam Thier from Boston.
Where are you?
Here I am. I want to be sure that when you're going after choices, that you're going after the proper ultimate choice. Now, those people who get the medication by mail and those people who get it at the pharmacy have to take the medication.
Yes.
And one of the problems that we always have caring for patients is they don't take the medicine.
Couldn't agree more.
Is there a relationship between which one of those things? Can you modify it so you are likely to get compliance?
Yeah, so we did study that in this analysis, and it does look like shifting people to home delivery slightly improves adherence, but disappointingly, it doesn't have a big effect on adherence. So another very important challenge to behavioral economics, and one that Kevin Volp, working down the street at the University of Pennsylvania, is very much thinking about, is how we can intervene to nudge people towards higher rates of adherence for some of these very important drug classes. But that's one of those nuts that has not been cracked yet.
So I wanted also to ask a question. Sorry, Nan Cohen, Princeton University. I wanted to ask you a question, David, also about the pharmacy. Who deals with unintended social consequences? Suppose everybody decided home delivery was the best choice. My local pharmacist, whether I know him or her by sight or not, is going to be out of a job before we know it. And some weekend, I'm going to need an emergency antibiotic within 2 hours, and there's going to be nobody to provide it. Who thinks about unintended social consequences?
So that's a great question. And indeed, lately I've been running around giving talks entitled Intended and Unintended Consequences of Nudges. And so I am trying to pound the table a lot on the issue of we need to understand all the ripples and not be focused on the proximate effects, but all the distal and unintended effects. And often these nudges look a lot less promising when you trace out all of their dynamic effects. And so we need to be mindful of that. Now, to answer your particular question, it turns out a very small fraction of all pharmacy prescriptions can even be handled by home delivery. So the local pharmacy is not going to go away. It's just about what volume of medicine will be delivered through the local pharmacy versus will be delivered through the home delivery. So you're right, the urgent antibiotic is not appropriate for home delivery, will never go through that channel. Well, maybe if Amazon delivers these things with drones. But at least right now, that's not likely to happen. And indeed, I want to also emphasize, I think for many people, it is better for them to go to the local pharmacy for whatever reason. It could be just having that interaction. It could be a face-to-face. Exercise, right, there you go. 2 birds, 1 stone. Yeah, now you're thinking.
Right.
Jack Liu from East Lansing, Michigan. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. So you talk about this, exercise. Actually, that's one of the reasons behind the behavior you see, right? And one of the reasons probably is social norms. So, for example, you mentioned that you bought a gym membership. But why did you do that, right?
My spouse.
Right, that's exactly. That's a social norm issue I think is very important. How the neighbors, friends, relatives influence your behavior. It's not just you make behavior choices by yourself, I guess.
Absolutely. So there is a lot of work on peer norming, and it's intriguingly mixed. So there's a very famous series of studies on a company called O-Power, which is a company that gives people social norming information about how much energy their neighbors are consuming relative to how much energy they're consuming. And when you tell people you're consuming more energy than your neighbors, and you mail them that information, honestly, I mean, it's not a lie, it's real information about their energy consumption, you drive down on average energy consumption by about 2%, electricity consumption by about 2%. So that has been a successful example of social norming. Now, but successful in a small way. We're not getting, we're not meeting the Paris Accord numbers. We're shaving off a little bit on the budget. But there are many other settings where when we tell people about what their neighbors are doing and how well their neighbors are doing on some category of behavior, for example, retirement saving, it has no effect and maybe even has a perverse effect. So we need to be careful about social norming. It's often thought to be all-powerful, and I think if you were to survey the whole literature, you'd find that in most cases it has a small or no effect. And the idea that by telling people what everyone else is doing, we're going to drastically change their behavior, unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the general finding.
Okay, we have a question back there.
Yes, hi. Thank you for that fascinating talk. My question is, who makes these choices in the first place? Who sets them out? It seems that
who regulates it?
No, it's who decides what the options are. Take your 401k example. It seems to me that the question assumes the status quo and therefore normalizes it to people. There used to be a time when companies actually had a different pension system and people got a guaranteed benefit at the end, not just contributions. Why don't you put that option in there and say, well, would you rather have a 401k the way it is now, or would you rather have a guaranteed pension from General Motors down the road? And parenthesis, if you want that, you've got to go out and organize in order to force the company to do it. But you're normalizing the very choices which have been imposed on people by just presenting them as the only options available.
Yeah. So I'm actually with you. I think that the system that we have now of voluntary retirement savings is not working. And we need to go back to the drawing board. And indeed, I keep talking about other talks I'm giving, and not this one. There is another line of work where we're trying to use this modeling framework to derive the socially optimal system of retirement saving. And it looks more like the system that you're endorsing than the system that we currently have. So I'm a fan of these other systems that are essentially have a lot of forced savings. And a pension is a forced saving system. And so I'm a fan of these compulsory saving systems. They exist essentially everywhere in the world except the US. And we, I think, should be asking ourselves whether our voluntary saving system is delivering what we thought it would deliver. Now, I do want to acknowledge we do have... Exactly, yeah. So this is what I was about to say. Social Security is our forced saving system. But in almost all of the countries, they have two forced saving systems. They have the national forced saving system, which is their Social Security system, and then they have firm-based, employer-based forced savings, whereas what we've done is migrated away from the firm-based tranche and kept the national tranche. And I think we should be asking ourselves whether the firm-based voluntary saving system is working for our society. There's certainly an argument to be had on both sides. I don't want to say that it's a trivial case for you, but certainly the model that I described to you, when you grind through that model and ask, what does it say society should be doing to help people save for retirement, it says that a voluntary system is going to be problematic because people with present bias are going to procrastinate joining these systems, and then when they get suddenly low on liquidity, withdraw money from these systems, and the systems will fail to retain large balances, which is exactly what we see in the US. The median household in the US retires with a $15,000 balance across all of their retirement savings accounts. So you take all retirement savings accounts, add them up for the household, and then look across all households retiring. The median balance is $15,000. So that system, maybe it'll work going forward, maybe it isn't working, and maybe it never will.
Question up in the balcony.
Hi, Joyce Starzel from Pittsburgh. My question is twofold. First of all, the stamp, the card that you send out with the stamp on it, do you put the real stamp or do you put that little thing on the side that says, it's everybody, what is it, the free thing they have on the corner? Or do you send out the real stamp? And is there a difference? I know when people send me things and they have that self-addressed return address with the stamp, real stamp, I feel guilty and I need to do something. The other piece is opting in or out of organ donation. I know we struggle with that, and do you have any ideas on that?
Okay, so when we did that study with the pre-posted postcard, I did not see the actual stamp. So I don't know whether it was a real stamp or whether it was just something that said postage free. Send me an email and I'll get back to you on that. Regarding organ donation, I do have a strong view on that issue. So it turns out that if you make organ donation the default, then almost everyone becomes an official organ donor. But the problem is when they actually go to the hospital and die, and their kids show up, and a discussion takes place about whether the organs of our parents should be donated, the kids say, well, yes, Dad was an organ donor, but that was just a default designation that the state made on his behalf. So we don't feel that that has moral weight, and we feel that we have the right to overturn that designation, and kids do, overwhelmingly. So what I would advocate is active choice for organ donation, that when people get their license, rather than a default designation, which they're not even attending to, we say to them, hey, this is an important decision. You may have religious beliefs that weigh on this. There are important social considerations here in terms of many, many hundreds of thousands of people needing organs, and we want you to spend 1 minute and actively decide, as we issue you your license, whether you want to be designated an organ donor or not. And there's more and more recognition that that sort of active choice system may be socially more appropriate.
Yeah. That had to be our last question, I believe.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Bye.